Right. Done.
Okay, everybody, welcome to the One Struggle podcast, episode 5 here. We have two new guests. We have Parsis, who is an Iranian patriot. He is someone that grew up in Iran, was raised in Iran, still living in Iran, by the way. And then we have Lucian. Say hi, everybody. Parsis, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks. Thanks for having me. And yeah, stuff like that basically. I'm not good at intro, sorry.
No, you're fine. And Lucian, how are you?
Hey, what's up, guys? I am Duginismo Invicto on Twitter, if you follow me.
Yeah, you absolutely should follow Duginismo. He's a treasure on the site. That's extremely time consuming. So, Parsis, um, which part of Iran did you grow up in? Like which region?
I was born in an area that you would consider to be traditionally Persian speaking in the desert. Yes, I'm from the desert, and but my parents aren't originally from that area. My mother is from Azerbaijan. She's an Azeri, Turkish speaking, and my father is in Mazani, which is the province by the Caspian coast. Um, I was born and raised. I mean, fuck it. I'll say it. I'll say the city. Like, I don't care. I was born and raised in the city of Semnan. City of Semnan is a very old city. It's like 2,000 years old. I lived there until I was 17. Semnan is like a very secure city, right? It's a very wholesome city. It's like traditional. But then, because I really didn't fancy the desert and the arid climate, we moved to north of the Alborz mountain to the Mazandaran province. This is my father's province, and now I live by the Caspian coast. I don't really have any connection to my mother's side of maternal side of my family because they're mostly Azeri, and I don't speak Turkish or that language. I'm pretty much Persian oriented. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah,
Ver-
he's really on the, for the people watching so they can get the sense, he's on the very Caucasian side of like the Iranian ethnic spectrum. And by Caucasian, I don't mean like snow white from the mountains of Scandinavia, from literally the Caucasus. Like
Yeah, because
I've
of
seen
my
his mother
maternal
and his
side.
dad. Yeah, they could be
Yeah.
like Italian, right? Like they are on the very pale side of Iranians.
Very interesting. Yeah, and Iran is, from what I believe I've gathered, it's very multi-ethnic. Like, how many ethnic groups would you say exist in Iran?
I mean, there's so many, like some of them you can consider an ethnicity or not. But if I'm gonna say the main ones on the top of my head, we have the Persians, which are the largest one. We have the Kurds, we have the Baluchs, we have the Azeris, we have the Mazanis, we have the Gilaks, we have the Lurs, we have, yeah, I think these are the main ones. But other than that, you have some other ethnicities that aren't really historical ethnicities, but because of their cities being important nowadays, they consider themselves to be an ethnicity like Khorasanis in the east. And if you're going to expand on the whole Iranian, like other than the nation state of Iran, I'll say Afghans, like the Pashtus are also Iranians, and Tajiks, of course, and the Ossetians in Armenia and Georgia also.
So
So
I'm
that,
just curious. I actually read when I was doing some research on World War II, when the USSR and Germany kind of like really did a number on Poland in terms of like military invasions. I remember reading somewhere that Iran took in a lot of Polish refugees. Are these
yes.
Polish refugees still living in Iran? Did they get repatriated at some point, or like what's the deal with them?
No,
I've never.
most of them were returned to Poland after the war, but we do have in Iran, we have many villages who are like from very exotic ethnic backgrounds. And when I say exotic, I mean from Iranian perspective. So, for example, we do have a village that they say that they're descendants of the Poles that came here and they're like really white. But we also have like villages called Rumian, which means Romans basically. And these people go back like to 18 centuries ago, and these are the prisoners of war from the Roman army that Persia defeated. And we also have gypsy villages that the language we don't understand. So yeah, like if you go to obscure ethnicities. We have a lot of villages that have these uncommon languages and features that look really exotic to Iranians. But yes, most of the Poles were returned, but I think some of them have stayed around the city of Qazvin, if I'm not mistaken. But they're fully integrated. Like we don't have a thing in Iran when you go out saying okay, we have Poles in Iran. Nobody's gonna say yes, we have Poles. Like it's a unknown phenomena. Only like very educated people know about this.
I see. So they're just viewed as like very light-skinned Iranians for the most part, generally
Yeah,
speaking.
because the thing is that what you have to understand is that because this in Middle East, in Mesopotamia and Iran, the concept of skin color and like this guy is white or this guy is brown doesn't really exist. Like it's more like a European American thing. Like here, as pale as I am, like nobody's going to treat me differently. Like for very brown Iranian. Yeah, like they say, okay, they're Iranians, but they look kind of funny. They look kind of European, but that's it. That's like the end of it.
Yeah, like Ahmadinejad, right? Like you would not be treated differently than
Yeah,
five
like
foot.
Ahmadinejad became president. Yeah,
Exactly.
Ahmadinejad is, by the way, the guy who denied the Holocaust in the UN.
Well, he held that international conference where all these people were able to get together and debate on the Holocaust. Am I not mistaken?
I think this is the same conference where a bunch of Jews, like ultra-Orthodox Jews, that also denied the Holocaust and were against the state of Israel, also participated. There's actually pictures of these Orthodox Jews with like their, the hair, how they do their hair, and Ahmadinejad hugging is like really funny.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't
Yeah.
know there were a lot of Orthodox Jews at that conference. I'm going to jump into some questions here that people were asking throughout the week here because I think it'll be a good way to get into other topics that we want to go into as well. So we
All right.
have a question here. It says, do young people in Iran still largely hold on to social conservatism? Is the Western image of young Iranians begging for freedom just propaganda, or is there some truth to it?
Okay, depends on the region because in the big cities, obviously much different than the suburbs, right? So I would say the typical metropolitan teenager, Iranian teenager, is very, very Western oriented, and this is something that goes back to before the Islamic Revolution. Iran has always been the most westernized country in the Middle East. Like during the Shah's reign, we had Western media, Western music coming into the country, and these were not necessarily subversive like it was in the 60s and 70s. And I would say the most subversive element that came to Iran during that phase was like hippie culture, and it was eradicated like in a decade. But nowadays, we do have people that have conservative ideas, but the problem is that the West, particularly the USA and Israel, have such a powerful propaganda tool. Like we have on satellite TV that is illegal, but everybody has it. We have channels in Persian with extremely high production quality and featuring extremely prominent public figures that are part of the Iranian diaspora against the Islamic Republic and living in the West, coming on, such as the Crown Prince or the so-called crown prince, and these people are actively campaigning against the public minds of Iranian youth. And these people, if you look at the net usage and the net income of these channels, they're all so negative. Like there's like literally no reason for these channels not to be bankrupted, but they're running, which is very suspicious. They're getting their funds from somewhere. But
Well, I
average
was about to
Iranian,
say, real quick, I'm actually reading I'm almost finished with the autobiography of Fidel Castro, and he talks about in detail how he was able to prove that, for decades upon decades, ever since the revolution was successful, essentially the CIA and, in connection with the Cuban mafia that existed in Miami, has constantly been, using Miami radio airwaves, if you will, to blast Western propaganda into like Cuba. And this sounds
yes,
very
exactly.
similar, but just to you guys instead, and on a much more sophisticated scale. Instead of just radio, now it seems to be like satellite TV. Am I correct in that?
Yes, this is satellite TV, and I'm gonna name the two main channels who are culprits in this. And these channels, like, I hate them with a passion. These two channels are BBC Persian. They should be self-explanatory, and Manoto. And I think Manoto, the channel, if you Google it, is directly funded by Mossad, I believe.
That wouldn't
And
shock me in the slightest.
yeah, they make all sorts of documentaries about Islamic revolution. And the thing is that, okay, Lucian gave me some perspective about your belief system, how you think Iran works. So I'm gonna dismantle some of that. If the mullahs hadn't done such a corrupt and poor job in running the country, this propaganda wouldn't work. Like the amount of loyalist people that we have in the country that are against Islamic Republic falling, such as myself, is disproportionately high when you take into account how poor of a job they've been doing in this country. Like the economy is essentially non-existent.
So I actually wanted to ask you about that. So, when we look at, for example, a country like China or a country like Cuba, we could use Cuba as a better example because, they face the sanctions on a similar level to, I guess, Iran does, or they did for a long time. They had a sort of state capitalism where they nationalized a lot of key industries. And whenever they did have privatized corporations, they would, make it to where the government was essentially completely in charge of how these joint business operations were going to work to make sure that these companies that were coming in, these companies bringing the Western capital into Cuba would essentially not be using these private enterprises to subvert the nation. Does Iran operate on a similar basis, or how would you sort of describe the economy of Iran?
The problem is that at the current point in time, we don't have any foreign investments coming to the country because of the sanctions. But you can be a self-sustaining country without Western capital investments and, basically not be what Iran is right now. The problem is that we have very large mafia syndicates within the Islamic Republic, IRGC being like the largest. And then you have also the religious organizations such as Astana Ghusl Razavi, which I don't know how to translate in English, but I will find it for you, which is like basically a clerical organization based in the province of Khorasan. These institutions make up for like massive budget intakes, and also in the parliament, like each year we have a budget submitted, and they say this is the national budget for this year, we're going to use it, right? And much of this capital is then simply disappears in the form of gold or assets in like Swiss banks or stuff like that. And nearly all of these people who are either Congress members or sons of prominent officials in Iranian government end up appearing in Canada. Canada is like the heaven for these guys. They essentially take more than 30% of the national budget each year and make it disappear. Like the amount of corruption and thievery and money that disappears is so high. The main reason that we're suffering economically is the sanctions. I remember last month I heard that USA has imposed the same amount of pressure that they have imposed on us, but also to Russia. But Russia isn't having the problem that we're having. And neither was Cuba. Cuba, which is a much smaller country, with much lower population. But if you want to know about Iranian economical system, you would be right. It's like basically what you described with Cuba, but the difference is that the corruption is extremely higher, and the other difference being that there is no Western capital coming into the country because of the sanctions.
So
I would like to interject for a second, Billy. I would like to add something.
Sure.
Because you're reading about Cuba, these people, they don't have, let's say, passionaries in the Lev Gumilev sense, like Fidel Castro or Ernesto Che Guevara. These people are way more of opportunist, conservative reactionaries that are sort of taking over the government. Like it's much more of a Franco situation or your standard third world sort of nobility fucking over the people thing. It's not really socialist. You understand what I mean?
Regarding the Iranian government, so I wanted to ask you this then, Parsis. So would you say that this is a result of Iran becoming like more liberal throughout time, or like did this corruption get worse and worse gradually since the Iranian Revolution? Like where can we pinpoint since the revolution when things were getting substantially worse in your point of view?
Okay, so Iran is considered a religious country in the eyes of the West, and it is in the public mind. Religion is important, even now it is. But what you have to understand is that unlike a country like Spain or Catholic nations before the Renaissance, um, Iranian Shia clergy were always regarded to be the lower of castes, unlike Zoroastrian clergy, who were considered to be like the highest caste. Iranian Shia clergy throughout history, even in Shia times, have always been considered to be frauds and low-class people, petty people, thieves, basically. Um, and after the revolution, the thing that happened is that we enabled these people to take power, and these people don't understand anything about the socio-economic repercussions of the actions that they do. They're basically looking to enrich themselves and their children. That's all they do. So yeah, this result has happened because we enabled the lower caste in our history to take power. If you go back to the times of our like older kings from 300 or 400 years ago, great kings who defeated the Ottoman Empire and invaded India, those kings, like Nader Shah or Shah Abbas, these kings always um, imposed severe like policies on clergy. They always maintained the clergy's power. They didn't ever let them have power. And if you go 100 years back in time and you say to any Iranian that the clergy will be having power in 60 years time in your country or in like 80 years time in your country, they're gonna go nuts. Like they wouldn't
So
understand
what was the
anything. How is it possible?
rationale? What was the rationale behind doing this? Why was this sold to the people as something that would benefit everybody?
Um, I would say two factors because you see, so long that we had our own policies, our own cultural decision making based on our own values, everything worked. But when USA started to influence Iranian policies, much of the tradition began to fade away, much of the Western values being imported. People resorted to like the rudiest thing they could find, and that was the religion. It is one aspect, but the other aspect that I think is extremely important is the person of Ayatollah Khomeini himself. I think if there was any other cleric other than Khomeini taking power or leading the revolutionary, surge, it would have failed because Khomeini was extremely good at speeches and he was extremely good at being charismatic. So I think the person of Khomeini did most of the heavy lifting for his people. And one other thing is that they trick people. Like they said this is going to be an Islamic republic. They didn't say anything about a theocracy or a clergy-run regime. So yeah, tricking people, the person of Khomeini being charismatic, and Iranian reactionary movements in contrast to Western values being imported were the three main factors that resulted in clergy taking power. Like it's a
That's
modern
very
world
Castro.
product.
Right? That reminds me, I know you're reading the biography, Billy, but Castro used to tell the American media and Cuban experts that he was fighting for social democracy. Do you know
You're
about
talking about
this?
during the revolution, right? Where like he wasn't saying
Yeah,
straight
yeah.
up that he was a Marxist-Leninist, basically.
No, no, I mean, even after the revolution, it took a couple of years for them to actually become
Right.
a Marxist. It's like a real
At least the
politics.
name only. Like, I mean, I would argue as well, he never really practiced Marxist-Leninist economics because, in my opinion, it's just kind of stupid.
It is, let's be
I
honest.
mean, there's a parallel to Khomeini. Khomeini was staying in Paris, and he was confronted by all the intelligence agencies of prominent Western countries, England, USA, Israel, and they told him, okay, you are very respected among the people. And the Shah, the reason the Shah, in like, if you read history from a Western point of view, they say Shah is a Western puppet, and he was. But the reason the revolution happened was because he didn't want to be a Western puppet. So Shah, at the end of his reign, and Khomeini at the beginning of his rule are two very similar entities. Only the Shah had expired, like his cards had run out. So Khomeini was in Paris, and they went to him and said, "Okay, Mr. Khomeini, you're really respected in Iran. What is your vision for the future?" And he said, "We're going to have an Islamic democratic republic." And these people were dumb. Like the Americans, no insult to Americans listening or to Billy himself, but Americans are dumb when it comes to Middle East. Like they don't understand
Americans
anything.
are really dumb, dude. I mean,
Yes.
you're not
Okay.
gonna get me pushing
So
back on
said,
that.
oh, democracy and Islam sounds good. Okay, so they said, okay, you're gonna go and you're gonna basically adhere to our politics in the OPEC and in the oil market, and opened basically the national industry and the national economy to our investors. And Khomeini said, okay, no problem. And then when he came, he killed all the people who were part of the National Front, either kill or exile. All the people who were part of the National Front. National Front was the Western French-oriented faction. But this faction was rather well treated, even though there were executions. Executions were minimal with this faction. Most of them were exiled. But the commies, okay, we have this organization, and they're still active and in league with the Americans. Their headquarters is in Albania these days. They're called Mujahideen Khalq, which means People's Mujahideen. They are a Muslim Marxist faction that were extremely popular. Like more than half of the revolutionaries weren't actually Islamic Republic oriented. They were Islamic Marxist oriented.
So you're telling me that in
All
this coalition of the Iranian revolutionaries who overthrew the Shah, like over half were literal Muslim communists?
Yes, my
That's
parents were
awesome.
such
Okay.
such people. Yeah, my parents were too. Like, a lot of people that were part of the revolution, you ask them, "Are you Tudei?" Which is the word that translates to part of the masses. They say yes, and but after it, the reprisals were so heavy by Khomeini and the executions were so high in number that everyone just abandoned those ideas.
So
And
he started
after
going
so
hard after Muslim communists who played a crucial role after the
yeah, like
revolution.
they executed anyone even for being suspected to be being part of the Mujahideen. And the
Now let me ask you
Mujahideen,
this: what was the reasoning? What did they tell everybody? Why are we going after these people that played a crucial role? Like, were they just playing up like how bad communism supposedly was, or what was it?
the rhetoric is that these people wanted to wanted us to become a satellite for the USSR. And the other reason is that they have corrupted the Islamic faith, which is also kind of true. And um, yeah, also these Mujahideens didn't make a good case for themselves because they carried out a lot of political assassinations. The second president of the Islamic Republic was killed in a car bomb by these people, and a lot of prominent. Okay, remember when I said clergy are like the lowest of the castes in Iran? We had some very, very, very good clergymen early in the Republic, but many of them were killed by the Mujahideen by bombs. The supreme leader himself, who is ruling right now, if you look at his left hand, is paralyzed because it was a bomb in a briefcase went off near him. Um, yeah, so they didn't make a good case for themselves, and also after they were exiled, their policies that they're carrying out now is so anti-Iranian that I would rather have any faction take power in Iran other than them. Like these people, there's no redemption for them.
So they've lost their way essentially. But let me ask you this: back when they were being persecuted by the Ayatollah after the revolution,
Right.
was there, in your opinion, any crucial evidence that would prove that these people were being directed or taking orders in some way from the USSR?
Um, you see, I don't think there were like empirical evidences, but when you're having like you're talking about the context of the Cold War, right? And if there's a revolution in the country, you're either becoming Western Bloc oriented or Soviet oriented. So the very nature of having a sickle in your uh, arm or having red flags, preaching Marxist manifestos and stuff like that. Na- they don't you don't need empirical evidences at that context in history. The very fact that you're wearing red, you're flying commie symbols, right? I think that was all they needed. And also another reason was that the leadership of this faction, they were not content with the Islamic Republic that Khomeini was going to make. They were willing to fight and stage a coup to establish their own government. So it was much a political struggle as well.
Also, from what I understand, Barsa,
Yep.
Iran had problems with communists since the 1910s, correct? And the Soviet
Yeah.
Union
Yeah. Of
indirectly
course.
involved, yeah, occupied half the country, obviously. But even before that, in the 20s,
Yes.
there was a short-lived communist state in the north, correct?
Were these
Yes.
Bolsheviks, or what sort of brand of communists were these people at the time?
The thing is that Iranians at that frame of time were kind of, I don't want to use this word, but they were kind of grug, right? Um, and especially at that point in time, um, communist ideals were storming everywhere. Like even in England, in Germany, there were a lot of communists.
Oh
among
yeah, well
the
people were
public.
very mad at capitalism at this time period all over the world, and for very good reason, I would say.
Yes, so see, Iran doesn't have that problem with capitalism at that point because it's not an industrial developed, you know, with a market essentially.
So is
It's
this
very
very
much
agrarian and serf like oriented?
yes, like the
Um,
Qajar society, the Qajar dynasty still was we were like really behind, and the discontent they adopted communism as a method of fighting the Qajar dynasty. It was more again, okay, imagine this new
Very
idea comes
Maoist,
in.
what you're describing.
Yeah, yeah, it's
Is
Maoist
you're describing.
essentially. Yeah,
It's
it's like a new
modernizing the
idea.
country through socialism, essentially.
Yeah,
which like
it's
goes
like
against what Marx even said to do, but yeah.
Who gives a shit?
Sorry. What'd you say?
So who gives a shit what Marx said?
I know, but my point is like Mao was, LARPing as this fanatical, Marxist, but he was trying to go straight from agrarian to like just communism, which is like not even what he was advocating for, which is like why I don't get why Dengists in China get labeled as revisionists, even though like I would argue in a lot of ways they were actually Dengists are a lot more consistent with the sort of thing. But yeah, I agree. In the end, it doesn't really matter.
But the second and the third position were always picked up by agrarian societies or societies that felt like they had left behind as a tool for modernization. I mean, after all, fascism in Italy, for example, was a movement that was meant to make Italy a predominant country in Europe again, from kind of a semi-agrarian, lesser power than it was at the time.
Oh yeah,
It's a
and
common dynamic.
Mussolini industrialized like over 70% of, or he nationalized over 70% of all industry, I believe, during his time there. So yeah, he wasn't messing around when it came to using socialism to try to build up Italy. But I was going to ask though regarding, I guess communism being like a big thing in Iran very early on. So you're essentially saying that um, these people were cynically using communism, I guess, get aid from the USSR in order to take out the predominant like factions that were ruling over Iran at the time.
um see occupied territories
Here,
and
you
the
just roboted. Can
first
you repeat the
communism, the
last 10
idea.
seconds? Sorry.
Okay. Is it okay now?
Yeah, you're fine now. Just repeat the last 10 seconds.
Okay.
Sorry.
So I said USSR did directly actually invade Iran several times, as Lucian pointed out, but the reason these people were fighting was not much for being aligned with the USSR. It was more so because the Qajar dynasty was so incompetent towards the end. Everybody hated them, right? So we had this movement called the constitutionalist movement, uh, who the people in this movement essentially wanted to establish a constitutionalist monarchy, and they succeeded. It's kind of like French Revolution, how this constitutionalist movement turned out. But the main motive of communists was that, okay, it was very organic, right? It wasn't politically motivated. They said, okay, this idea of communism that they're preaching, and these are Iranian peasants, essentially, who were just taught to read, right? Oh my God, communism sounds really good, and our current rulers are a bunch of decadent nobility that don't do anything. They're just exploiting the land, stealing the wealth, right?
Right.
So they adopted this idea as a reaction to the Raja dynasty. I wouldn't say USSR played a direct role in leading these movements. These movements very, very much autonomous in their actions, I would say.
I see what you mean. And then I'm going to ask you another question here. It says what does he see in an Iranian third position slash more importantly, are there any remotely prominent third positionist groups or parties that exist in Iran?
Um, if I want to answer that question, like, can we get a quick rundown of what does he mean by third position exactly?
Sure. So I guess with third position, he's probably referring to, I guess, something that's very similar to fascism, I would say, at least an Iranian form of it. Like, does any of that sort of exist in Iran? Given, the
I
history
would
between Iran
say,
and things like the Third Reich. Like, for example, like Iranians were considered Aryans under the Third Reich and I believe had a decent relationship with the German government. during World
Yes,
War II.
I would say fascism is like very directly related to industrialization, and I think we're industrializing really rapidly. But I would say, like, if you look at the Third Reich or even Mussolini's Italy, it has a lot of socialist aspects, right? And while our constitution and the values that they're preaching also has these values, again, they're all ideologies, like no ideology is gonna promote corruption, right? So I would say
Right.
so long that it's yeah, right. I would say so long that this extreme form of corruption continues to exist in the Islamic Republic, we're not going to be part of any of these ideologies. We're going to be Islamic Republic, as kind of its own entity. But if you're asking for future potential, I think that any change to the Islamic Republic right now would lead to rapid westernization of the country and collapse of any chance to become any ideologically oriented government. It would just become another, um, let's say, Tunisia or another Egypt, let's say,
Or
even worse,
Serbia.
because Iranians are already um, I wouldn't say like I don't think Iran has a capacity for civil war because Iranians from all political factions, Iran is not a artificially built country unlike Syria and Iraq. These countries tend to have civil wars because they're made up of a lot of ethnicities, authentic ethnicities, united under a false British-made identity that has never existed. But Iran is not such a country. So Iranians, even like for example, let's say just for the sake of argument, I'm a ultra far right Iranian, right? Uh, an ultra far left Iranian would have no enmity towards me. Like in the common populace, the people of Iran are extremely united in their Iranian identity, even among Iranians who loathe themselves for being Iranian, which is a common phenomenon because of Western influence. You can still see notions of, patriotism and nationalism. So I wouldn't say we have the potential for civil war. But when I say Egypt or Tunisia, I mean a country that is Muslim in name, but is extremely degenerate and Western in its society. And this will all lead to exploitation of the masses of this new consumerist generation by the free market, by the new wave of Western capital, by McDonald's and pornography, essentially.
To
Oh,
interject a second here, Parsis,
Go
what
ahead.
you're describing to me, and to give a sense of these things to people that are maybe a bit more first world and they don't understand sort of how backwards a lot of places were until recently. It reminds me of the Franco government, where the Franco government was not really even fascist. It was just big guy
no.
with gun runs country, right? It's a very 17th century kind of system. Like he might as well be like a warlord, essentially. And
Yeah.
that's kind of the vibe you're giving me with the things you're describing. It's kind of almost pre-modern. If fascism and communism are not really possible in in Iran yet, in that sense.
Yeah, because okay, what some people have to understand is that okay, Europeans often diss Americans for not having a history. Iranians usually diss Europeans for not having much of their historical heritage left, right? So in Iran, the notion of Iranian monarchism has always it continues to exist now. Like you could say we're living in a de facto monarchy, right? Like absolutist monarchy, you could say, with theocratic elements. So neither communism nor fascism ever like these are new, very very new ideologies, right? In a historical context. So in Iran, because the concept of Iranian monarchy is still a kind of a romantic relationship between the people and this concept of Iranian monarchy. Um, these ideologies never get to really expand. So I don't think you'll ever have a fascist, like publicly declared fascist run regime in Iran. Nor do I think we'll ever have a overtly socialist or communist regime in Iran. I think Iran, the way its culture, the way its heritage works, is that it's always be a monarchical system. Even if it's not monarchical in name, it's going to be monarchical always.
What you are saying also reminds me of, for example, sorry for not letting you speak, Billy, but
No,
I'm
no,
using
you're
my brown
fine. I like
privilege.
this. I like this. I'll cut you off if I don't like what you're doing. So keep going.
Okay. So it reminds me a lot, for example, are you familiar with the history of the Republic of Korea, the bad one, not the good one, like
Me
the Southern
personally,
one?
I am not very well versed in Korean history in the slightest. I'm not even going to pretend to be.
Okay, so the thing about the Republic of Korea, South Korea as we know it, is that after World War II, when it was theoretically this capitalist democratic republic, right, it was just, yeah, we have this name because this was given to us by the Americans, but it was just a dictatorship run the same way the North was, which is this 18th century big guy with a gun tells me what to do, and family connection is everything. It's a very you know how people LARP about being traditionalists, Billy?
Oh,
It's
yes, I
like,
do.
yeah, it's actual traditionalism, which is everything is about power and family connection, and it's about struggle. It's not really about ideology, right? It's not very intellectualized. You understand what I mean, Parsis?
Yeah, same here. I mean, yeah, I agree.
It's like when American leftists is going to be like, Che Guevara was a fascist. Che Guevara was this, Che Guevara was that. Che Guevara was my autistic academic definition of what Marxist is. But in reality, if you asked him, he would say, I'm a Latin American patriot. Right? I'm a guy that's fighting America for Latin America, basically. Right? It's a very apolitical, in a sense, position.
Yeah. No, I totally understand what you're describing here, Lucian. And I was going to ask you this, Parsis. Generally speaking, so I know you already kind of said that, people tend to be more, I guess, conservative and I guess more rural and suburban areas. And, you go to the bigger cities like Tehran and you're going to find more people that are going to be more outspoken against this sort of stuff. But generally speaking, would you say majority of people, approve of, generally speaking, of the government in Iran and would prefer to
No,
have this over
no, no.
like Western
Majority of the people
liberalism?
prefer, yeah, majority of people. Okay, let me give you an. Okay, so for first off, majority of the people are against Islamic Republic, and the public is outraged at the Islamic Republic as a whole. Like more people are, realizing what's really going on. But the dynamic of how it works is that you live in America, right? And you see the hidden oppression of the government and of open market and of capitalism, and essentially the system that you run your country in your personal life and in the life of many other Americans, right?
Of
And
course, yeah.
because of that, yeah, you look at Iran and say, okay, this is a much more traditionalist country. It is actively fighting the America that I hate, right? People in Iran have a similar outlook. They see, okay, the Islamic Republic has made the economy, like our currency is the most worthless currency in the world right now. We have the 18th highest GDP in the world, and our currency is the most worthless currency in the world. They see this. They see, at the end of the day, the middle class and the lower classes don't care really about politics. They care about the economy, right? They see, oh, the economy doesn't work, and then they turn on their TV. They see BBC Persian. They see Maruto. They see, oh my God, in the West they're so humanitarian. Oh my God, the economy is so good. Oh my God, there's no religious extremism. Oh my God, everything's so nice, right? They fall for this image, and combining that with their own rage of how bad the situation is, they turn on the Islamic Republic. But this is not an ideological hatred. It has become an ideological hatred. How? Because let me tell you something. Even now, it's not so late. If the Islamic Republic somehow manages to improve the economy and remove mandatory hijab as it stands today, or lighten the protocols of mandatory hijab, the majority of the opposition will dissolve. This isn't the most important thing in this country is the economic issue, but the the Western media that's targeting the average people in Iran says no, you're suffering economically because the ideology of your country is so oppressive, it's so anti-Western, it's so anti-humanitarian that you're suffering because of it. It's not an economic issue. This is a this is a ideological issue. But the fact is that if you look at Iranian history, on the all the odd on the sorry on all other occasions that Iran has been a prosperous country or it has even been a superpower on the world stage, Iran has always been an oppressive, very centralized country. Like the thing that we're going through right now, we've been going through for 3,000 years. It's nothing new. The people are outraged because the economy is bad, and the majority of the people are middle class, lower class. These people care about the economy. At the end, they don't care if you have progress in Syria or Iraq. They don't care if you have built this drone or have shot down that U.S. Aircraft. They care about the economy, and the economy is so bad. And when they see the corruption, like the news is crazy. You see this kid, child of a cleric, right? Like very top position cleric, ends up in Canada with over $300 million stolen money from the country, or in some cases over billions of dollars for one single person in Canada. When they see this and then they see their own economic status, they start raging really, really hard. And I don't know if you remember, but last year around this time, we had massive protests in Iran. And Lucian remembers at that time they cut out the internet in nationwide for 1 week. And that was over the fact that overnight they announced that the price of gasoline and of petrol has tripled. Has tripled. Like people couldn't afford it anymore. So there was like massive riots all over the country. This is an economic issue at its heart. It's not an ideological issue. People pretend to be it's being ideological because they're brainwashed by the Western media. As I said, if you fix the economy and you remove just some of your retarded public restrictions, then the majority of opposition not only will disappear, they will integrate into your ideology.
I see where you're coming from here. So you're saying there's a lot of corruption going on the state level, and what I'm kind of curious is what do the average Iranians kind of think about the role in which Iran has played, they played a crucial role essentially in, helping Syria not get taken over by terrorists, were funded by the CIA and by Israel. They play a crucial role in assisting like Palestine and Hezbollah. And what do the average Iranians think of this role that, Iran has played, especially when I've seen like, how big the funeral was for General Qasem Soleimani, who was assassinated by Donald Trump.
Yes. So first of all, I want to say that, okay, I'm just gonna go ahead and say it. Iranians are kind of dumb, okay? Like the public is really dumb. Like they will believe into political ideologies, and so long that they think, how average people they go on Reddit and they read one opinion and it makes total sense to them, okay? Oh yes, this is completely correct. And then they read the reply and they say, oh my God, this guy is completely correct. The previous guy that I thought he was right is actually wrong. And with each comment, they keep switching sides authentically in their brain because they can't really process what's wrong and what's right, right? So with each,
Wait,
they
you're
just
telling me they're
understand what?
Iranians are women, is what you're telling me?
Yeah, kinda. So what happens is that um, Iranians, um, especially with Qasem Soleimani, because the propaganda on Soleimani was extremely large. Like even people who were against the Islamic Republic, who were against the Ayatollah, these people, even they were grieved at Soleimani. But the thing is that Iranians historically have a lot of tensions with Arabs. Like I would say, if there's one group that Iranians have most tension with, it's probably the Arabs. And when okay, 20 years ago, we were also supplying Hezbollah. We were also allied with the Assad regime in Syria. And even 20 years ago, we were beginning to influence Iraq, right? We were putting our national budget into IRGC in order to influence these countries, these regions. But the economy wasn't as bad, right? So people kind of went meh. But when they're seeing that basically buying meat right now is luxury here, and then they see so many missiles, so many supplies going to Syria and Lebanon and Iraq, and combining that with the with the propaganda of these Iranian channels that are based in the West, that tells them, oh my God, Hashd al-Shabi and Hezbollah, they are terrorists. Islamic Republic, they were in link with Taliban and ISIS. The Islamic Republic attacked this civilian or this political assassination in Romania, right, for example. The public opinion, again, is very centered around the economy. So they see their own situation getting worse, but still missiles and cash and equipment going to Syria and Lebanon, the countries that are Arab, that are Sunni, people tend to become outraged. Like they don't understand why their money is going there. I understand why our money is going there. I'm for it actually, but for the public mind, for average Iranian, it's very rage-inducing.
I
So
would like
why?
to
Oh, yeah.
comment on
Sorry. Keep
this.
going.
So, so people can understand, Iran is not the Soviet Union, right? There is the relationship between the people and the state is not particularly intense on an emotional level, right? Would you say this is correct, Parsis? It's not like there is an ideological direction that the country is on board with, really.
No, there is. There is like the supporters of the Basij, which is the youth militia, essentially Hitler Youth of Iran.
Yeah.
Um, these people have a very clear ideology. It's just that the ideology is poorly constructed, so the majority really don't fall in line with it. So there's no emotional connection or ideological connection between the majority of the public and the state, but the state has very deep ideological and emotional connections to the core part of its supporters.
Yeah, that's also very medievalist, right? It's yeah.
Yeah, it's a
So what
religious thing.
is there's no like mass politics, really, is what you're talking.
They
Like
attempt to make it to be on the presidential levels. That's what the presidential election is all about. It's like a
straight,
show.
right?
Yeah, it's like a soap opera. It's essentially what the
So you are Western. Like, why does
yeah, I
America
said
hate you? A
you're a
fake
Western
election.
country. Yeah, like there are some elements of Westernization present in this country even before the revolution that that has become so normalized. And these are not necessarily bad things, all of them. Some of them are good, but they're so present and so implemented on such a large scale that even a fundamentalist Muslim regime like the Islamic Republic fails to eliminate them. So yes, we have fake elections. The whole cycle of elections is about creating the illusion that we have mass politics. And it is summarized in two factions, the conservatives and the reformists, who, in my opinion, have literally no difference. But for 40 years, even people who hated the Islamic, they essentially brainwashed the people in this way. They would introduce a very conservative um, candidate, and he would propose ideas that were essentially very, very dumb. And then they would put a reformist candidate, and he would say, okay, your ideas are kind of dumb, or am I still going to reform some of this, give some more social liberties to the population? And people like my mother, who essentially wanted to kill all mullahs and all Islamic fundamentalists in this country, would think, oh my God, if the conservative is elected, we're doomed. So for 40 years, the turnout for the elections have been
My God,
like
if the Republicans
incredibly
win,
hard.
they're going to kill all the
Yeah,
black people. If the
yeah,
Republicans win,
exactly.
yeah,
Yeah, but now, and people like my father, who I consider to be like really intelligent and understanding politically, he never voted after the revolution. Like he saw through this like immediately. By my mom and a lot of my friends, and you have to understand, my real life friends are like very, very Western oriented liberal people. And these people always voted. Like the current
yeah, they're like
president, yes, he's a
you have
yeah,
an
the bugman,
Iranian,
and
yeah,
yeah, and you see, the current president Rouhani, he's a reformist. Yes, he's a cleric, but he's a reformist. So when he came, he said, "Oh my God, liberty! Oh my God, easing of, you know, oppression on music and like public this, public that." And my friends thought, and his opponent was Raisi, and Raisi is like this judiciary guy, ultra tough on crime, ultra conservative, ultra religious. He was the head of the Osman Quds Razavi, which I mentioned earlier, is one of the religious syndicates of the country. And people saw Ibrahim Raisi as like this antichrist figure, and this, oh my God, we have to elect Rouhani, and that was the highest election turnout ever, just because they portrayed Raisi as a villain, and Rouhani as this moderate reformist. And the funny thing is that we have three branches in Iranian government. We have the judiciary, we have the executive, and we have the legislative branches. And the three main political candidates, Raisi, Rouhani, and Ghalibaf, are all of them after 1 year after the election, all of them became heads of these three branches. Raisi is the head of the judiciary branch of the government, and the other guy, Ghalibaf, is the head of the legislative, is the head of the parliament, and Rouhani is the president. So that whole cycle of who becomes the president, who has the power, is like such a charade because all of them now are leading all three branches of government.
So let me just ask you this on the topic of the three branches of government you have, which sounds similar in a lot of ways to, like, in theory, I guess, the way the Constitution was drafted for America. What sort of checks and balances does the Ayatollah have if one of these three branches of government does something that he considers to be so out of line?
Every authority. He has every authority. He is commander in chief. He is the leader of the faithful. He can remove people from power, appoint people to power, remove ministers, appoint ministers, disapprove of decisions that are essential. Even if he doesn't directly, like a lot of the time, he maintains this image that I'm just a spiritual leader, even though in the constitution he has all the powers, right? He maintains that I don't really do political stuff. He mostly, quote unquote, guides people on Friday prayers. And for example, let's say he says, I really, in my personal opinion, do not approve the appointment of that guy, right? Even though he hasn't ousted him or removed him from power, then it becomes a very hot debate in the parliament of whether this guy is qualified for the job or not. So behind the scenes, he has absolute power. He can appoint and remove anyone. He can uh, make up military strategies, economical strategies. He leads the IRGC. He has absolute power.
And has he ever intervened in certain ways that you've absolutely approved of and you're glad that he did?
Um, if okay, we don't have empirical evidences for decisions that they have made, uh, or Ayatollah has made. But I would say if the decisions to keep the Syrian offensive and the Iraqi Hashd al-Shabi support going was his decision, then I support those decisions. But I haven't seen any decisions made by his person explicitly stated. As I said, he doesn't really do political decision making on the surface level. Like people don't really attribute these political decisions to be made by him because he doesn't really say it in public. Um, but yes, if we're going to talk about general direction that we've been going, I think other than the fact that he's not cracking on corruption, I think he's part of the corruption. In fact, the decisions for our military and political advances in Iraq and Syria have been decisions that I support.
And let me ask you this. On the topic of Israel, how do Iranians, generally speaking, feel about that certain state, which, you know, if you look at all the evidence, pretty much tells America what to do all the time?
Yes. Israel, okay, we have people who support Israel, but these are mostly upper middle class people who spend their time all day on Twitter or journalists who are libertarians. But I would say even now that we're extremely divided on the question of whether or not we want an Islamic Republic or not, and the majority of the population is against Islamic Republic and the Ayatollah, even now the public opinion remains extremely bleak on Israel, and for very good reasons. Because even in a historical context, I think people who are familiar with history know that Jews from Israel throughout history have been subject to constant persecutions by all sorts of nations, the Roman Empire, all European nations, and even non-European nations. In Mesopotamia, we had Babylonians and Egyptians persecuting, and I think many people would agree for valid reasons these persecutions happen. But if there's one nation who has always been benevolent to these people, who has liberated them, in fact, it was the Persians who liberated them. It was the Persians who funded the building of the Second Temple. Even though I doubt this has happened historically, this is their own narrative. They say that the Persian kings helped us build our Second Temple, and under the Sassanid dynasty, the only religious minority who had extra privileges and had power in the court of the king were the Jews. Even Christians were massacred, but not the Jews. And even in the Islamic era, the Jews had all sorts of privileges. And before the revolutions, Jews had all sorts of privileges. In the last 40 years, the amount of enmity that these people have expressed towards our country shows so much historical ingratitude. So the public opinion towards them, even the factions that are quite anti-Ayatollah, remains bleak on Israel. But if you go to Twitter, right? If you go to Twitter and if you look at for Iranians, you would see a lot of pro-Israel thing. Don't let that fool you, because that's like mostly journalists and upper middle class people who spend most of their day reading. For example, my mother is pro-Israel, right?
Oh
But she's
boy.
this like,
Yeah.
yeah, like my mother is like this
So
middle-aged
what's her
libertarian.
rationale? I'd love to know. Like, why does she support Israel?
Okay, what you have to understand is that again, if the Islamic Republic hadn't done such a extremely poor job, and in some cases, like the shit that they do is like cruel, like they play with public emotion, like they make people hate them. For example, there was this wrestler, right, 2 months ago, who was arrested, and they said he had killed someone. There was no empirical evidence that he had killed someone. There was no footage, no hard evidence that he had killed someone, and they voted for execution for no reason. And
I
even
thought
in
he
the
was
court,
executed for being anti-Iran. I thought that was what he did.
no, no. He was just a simple wrestler. He was protesting, and they said that he had killed someone during the protest, which if he had done, I support the execution, but the trial was done behind closed doors and it was never publicized. And the lawyer of this guy repeatedly said that they're just not allowing me to talk to him, they're not allowing me to conduct a fair trial, they're not allowing me to present evidence, the prosecutor is not giving any evidence. And then they suddenly executed him without any warning overnight, and they forced the family to bury him in night. And this is common occurrence. Another factor that makes people hate Islamic Republic is their excessive cruelty. Like people are feeling alienated with the Islamic Republic because of these acts of cruelty and because of also, as I said, economic pressure. So the economic pressure has built the foundations for ideological hatred, and their cruelty adds to that, right? And so my mother thinks, and a lot of people who share her ideals think that Iran, as it is now, the Islamic Republic, is the most evil regime in the history of the universe. They literally believe this, right? And they say, oh, Israel. And my mother supports Donald Trump. Is the state of his being. Like she says, okay, oh, I want Trump to be elected, and I want more sanctions, even though there are no other fields that he can sanction us on, and I want him to invade and kill all the mullahs. We have these people in the country. Like this is dangerous. If the Islamic Republic doesn't do a very rapid reformation, if they don't remove the syndicates and the mafias, and if they don't ease on all the retarded cruelty that they're doing, then more and more people are going to become like my mom. And my mother is not a vicious woman. She's like a very kind-hearted woman. Like this is not, they're brainwashed, and this brainwashing only is made possible, as I said, by the poor economic situation, by the cruelty, and by retarded public operations policies.
So it seems like, based on what I'm gauging here, it would appear that Iran is not very great at putting out propaganda that really dismantles the lies that the West is constantly
Yeah,
pushing
it's
into their
terrible.
country.
Yeah, it's
And
terrible.
why do you think that
They can't do a
is?
good job. Okay, what you have to understand is that the Iranian leadership is composed of two, I would say, two factions. On one hand, you have competent people in the back. These are mostly active in behind the scenes of Ministry of Information and the IRGC. And the other core is composed of dumb clerics. And dumb clerics have equal or even more power than the former faction. So these people are responsible for the propaganda. And as I said, your propaganda, when it is solely based on religion in the year 2020, and you don't really successfully, like, your production value is really low, you don't understand how it goes. Like a lot of cultural institutions in Iran who are run by the state are religious organizations run by, again, these dumb clerics, so they don't know how to exploit this. In fact, you could sway much of the population even anti-Ayatollah ones, if you correctly presented a good propaganda. And I would say they're doing better these last couple of years, but I think it's too late. As I said, so long the like propaganda is secondary to how well the people are living, right? If people are hungry, you can't tell them, oh, we're struggling in Iraq and Syria and it's worth it, and also have your own children, the children of high-ranking officials, steal the money and go to Canada. Like it just doesn't work. It doesn't matter how good your propaganda is, while you're having a terrible economy and insane corruption. But yes, generally it's weak. It's been better, but I think it's late. It's too late for propaganda to change anything now.
I see. And I would ask you this. So I actually did a YouTube debate with this one guy. You may have heard of him. Maybe you haven't. His name's Adam Green. He runs No More News. And one of the central things that sparked this whole thing off between him and I was we got in an argument on Twitter. He kept insisting that Iran is a Soviet satellite state along with Israel, and that these are puppet states of this USSR that he claims never really went away and is still practicing crypto communism. And I would ask you, one, what do you think of the validity of that claim? And two, what do you think of the fact that Amir Farquhar tends to be the main source of information who put out this sort of garbage, in my opinion, that Iran is a Soviet satellite state?
I don't know the name of the guy you mentioned, the Iranian guy. I haven't heard of him. And if we're going to examine conspiracy theories, Iranians are like the gods of conspiracy theory. Like there is this conspiracy theory that says the Ayatollah and the American deep state are in league, and Iran is the boogeyman in the region to create conflicts in order for the military-industrial complex in the USA to sell weapons. Like if you want to believe in that, you can believe in that, but it's kind of really dumb. Like if you look at how Iranian state is actively working against Americans, unless you believe that, you know, if you want to talk about conspiracy theories and if you want to start believing in things to console yourself about how the world is so crazy and oh my God, you're so oppressed. Yeah, you can do that, but at the end, it's a conspiracy theory. I don't think the Soviet Union exists. I don't think that Israel and Iran are aligned. But yes, there are conspiracy theories even more crazy than that in Iran among like middle class and upper middle class, like
Well,
weirdos essentially.
Middle listeners love their conspiracy theories, bro.
Yeah, they do.
Oh,
Like,
like Southern Europeans and Middle listeners, they make Americans seem reasonable in terms
yeah.
of conspiracy theory. Do you have like people that think that like America is shooting lasers down into your country? Like, do you have this conspiracy
Yeah,
theory?
yeah, we do. My
Yeah, yeah,
brother is actually one of them.
we have this here as well.
So, um, what was I going to say? Yeah, I forgot. Go on.
No, that was that was a good answer. Another thing I was going to ask too is what do the Iranian people think of the role in which like Russia has been playing in terms of one, how they've been acting as an as their own thing in the Middle East, and especially like the Syrian civil war, and like increasing relations with Russia, what does the average like Iranian think about like Russia, and like what do you actually think about how what
Okay.
Russia's doing in the Middle East, and how it's impacting you in the state of Iran?
Okay. I want to say that when you ask me about average Iranian and public opinion on average, my answers aren't really reliable. I think nobody's answers are actually reliable on this because it's really, really, really hard to make categories of ideologies and beliefs about matters in Iranian population and allocate people to those categories because there's no data, there's no surveys, you just have to answer these questions based on your own personal experience. So all these things that I say are based upon my personal opinions. Please, everybody who listens, don't think that I'm some sort of expert that everything I say is true and oh, this percentage of Iranians think that and that percentage of Iranians think that. And but again, my personal opinion is that because Russia has done us really dirty in the past, like really, really dirty. Um, Public opinion about Russia isn't really favorable, but myself, I used to believe that Russia is our greatest ally. I was a Russophile like a couple of years back. I love Putin. I love Russia. I love their policies. I love that we're allies. But majority of Iranians have a negative. Like Iranians hate two nations more than anyone in recent times, and it's not America and Israel. It's England and Russia. Because a lot of our former imperial territory is taken away by these countries, and well, they hate England more so because of the internal policies that they impose in Iran. But Russia historically has been really mean to us. So I would say the majority of uh, Iranians really don't like Russia. But what I think about Russia and our alliance right now, I think Russian and Iranian interests ultimately collide with each other, and we cannot be trustworthy allies. But I think for the time being, this alliance needs to stand. Like we need this relationship to keep going. I
Yeah,
don't
this
think
this
Russia is a
reminds
long-term
me
ally.
this reminds me sort of like when Fidel Castro was being interviewed in his book, and they're asking about the USSR, and he's sort of talking about like, yeah, they played an important role in, making sure that the regime wouldn't get toppled by the CIA, by America. But at the same time, because Soviet archives were released in the 90s, he also made it clear that not only just the archives, but his general experience was that he always felt like Cuba was always on a need to know basis, that Cuba was never included in like important talks with America regarding important policies that would impact Cuba directly, and that in a lot of ways, Russia pretty much kind of looked out for its own interests first above everything else. And it sounds very similar to what you're kind of describing here.
Well, Cuba is at the end. Iran is located in Russia's doorstep. Russia is an imperial power. Iran still is a weak imperial power. It aspires to be again a great imperial power, and these two nations will eventually collide. Like if they successfully overcome the pressure that they're facing right now. So yeah, for now it is good, but we always have to look over our shoulder for Russia. Like Russia, at the end of the day, has interest in Caucasus. That's where we have interests. They have interest in Syria and to a lesser extent Iraq, and they have interest in Central Asia. All of these territories are territories that are historically part of the Iranian imperial borders. And Iran continues, for example, the conflicts right now in Caucasus. Iran and Russia are both behind Armenia, but if there is no other Western power to unite us against them, like the US is right now, then they will definitely collide with the Russians. And the Russians are a threat because they're really powerful. Like they're much more powerful than us, and they understand the region's politics, which is dangerous. Because the reason that America has failed in Afghanistan, the reason they have failed in Iraq, and the reason they failed in Syria is because they don't understand anything about the political, religious dynamic of and cultural dynamics of the region they're trying to influence. And but Russia does. Russia really, really understands because that's why when they were lost in Afghanistan, they left. They didn't try to stay for 30 more years. Um, they just gave up on it. They understood that Afghanistan is basically unconquerable so long that Taliban stays the way it is.
I
I
see.
would
And
like to point out, Marcis, one second. I would like to point out that if you read Eurasianist thinkers and philosophers and political scientists from Russia, they all consider Iran this country that's going to be a satellite of Russia. They
Yes, of
really
course.
view it as something that they have the right to control over America. I think it's the great game, as usual. Russia aspires to control the entirety of Asia, right?
Yes,
Eventually.
correct.
But we all know it's going to be Spain in the end, so it's okay. Like, we don't have to worry about it.
exactly, they never expect the Spanish, but they always come in at the end. But what I was going to ask here is, well, on the topic of, Asia, how do you feel in terms of like this new trade deal that was conducted between Iran and China that's going to open up a lot of business between the two nations? Do you think this is an overall good that's going to help with the economic situation that's occurring in Iran, or do you think this is going to potentially end up in a way of China economically exploiting Iran?
I don't think we're ceding any points to China to economically control us for now. I think that the contract does make a precedent for it in the future, and we have to be vigilant not to expand on it. But I think the deal as it stands right now is a good deal. But I also think that Russia and China also will collide definitely. Like there will be tensions in the future if they survive in their current forms. And I don't mind Iranian Chinese relations. Like I think this deal as it stands right now is a good deal. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and that seems to be a common theme from people who I'm friends with that tend to be more critical of people like Alexander Dugin. It's like one of the biggest arguments against Duginism is the fact that Alexander Dugin seems to be almost like a neocon in terms of his rhetoric against China,
Yeah.
which I think is interesting. I don't know why Russia really thinks that, I don't know, they're going to come out on top of over China in the end, because that's just not the trajectory I'm really seeing, to be quite honest with you.
Yeah. About this treaty, I have to say
Russians
that
are very supremacist. Really, you have to understand this. They they really believe that ultimately they're the most industrially and technologically advanced people in Asia. They're really coping with China becoming the greatest power in the world. What's going on with Putin in many ways is a reaction to the Soviet Union losing a lot of the influence it used to have previously.
Well, yeah, I
one
mean,
thing
after
about
they,
the treaty that the thing with the treaty is that just so people have a better understanding of how people have the mindset of people in Iran is that because the misery of people is so high, right? They have developed this inferiority complex, and that they always think that we are the worst of people on the planet. So when the deal was first announced with China, they said, "Oh my God, we made a revolution. We fought against Iraq. We bled. We spent money. We gave blood, and now China is annexing all the islands in the Persian Gulf." Of course, China is not doing this, but the people of Iran, in their misery, have this mindset: "Oh, we're so terrible. Like everything's terrible here. Like anything that happens, they say, oh my God, look at the West. Oh my God, look at the UAE, how great they are, how this, how that, and how poor we are, how terrible we are." They don't really understand. So the China deal at first, it sparked a lot of controversy. They said that we're going to give away the Kish Island, that we're going to give military bases to China, that we're going to give them all the fish and the oil supplies in the Persian Gulf, the crazy stuff. And none of them actually happened, but this is the way that public mind went about it until the text of the agreement was published, and this went away.
Can you
hmm,
explain something, Parsis, to me?
Go
Because
ahead.
I wanted to pick this up and it hasn't come up yet. Can you tell me about middle class Iranians, right? And how liberal are they? And how frequent is the Bagman phenomenon, the Redditor phenomenon in Iran?
Hmm. I would say that um, the middle class libertarian oriented ideology maliciously um, is not maliciously formed in the mind of these people. They're mostly either brainwashed, or in many cases, they actually develop it in their brains in a real, actually authentic manner. Because, as I said, when the Islamic Republic does such a poor job, you naturally make conclusions yourself against that. And um, for example, a woman removed her hijab, right? It's not a big deal like in any sane society, removing your hijab shouldn't be a big deal. But this woman got like 18 years in prison, right? Like I think we can all agree that this is like stupid. Okay? So
well, I mean, I have my own opinion on the matter. I mean, if I'm mistaken, I believe she was trying to make a spectacle of herself and trying to, I guess, really make a scene. And in that sort of context, I can actually sort of understand why Iran would want to
no,
basically
because the
clamp
mandatory
down on
hijab is
that.
stupid. No, because mandatory hijab is stupid. At
And
least in the
also,
form that
even
it
like
is now.
this is another thing people don't understand, Parsis, is that, for example, during the Caliphate, right, there were
Right.
like prostitutes, women would go around
Yes.
without hijab, people drink alcohol, people in Iran drink alcohol. And is this thing where Europeans look at Middle East and they think is this exotic place of this fully medieval people, but in reality, it's a lot more like any other place, really. Like people are just normal for the most part. Extremism is not something that normal people do anywhere.
Like for example, conservative families, like mildly conservative families, like the biggest concern is that their daughter shouldn't be outside like in dark hours because it's kind of dangerous and you don't know what might be happening. But even like the family of my fiance, which is like I would say conservative, doesn't have any. They have an issue with hijab. Like these people who are like, for example, my fiance's mother is a. She always wears her hijab outside, very complete hijab, not in the Arabic style, in the Iranian style, but she's against mandatory hijab and she's against like most of the stupid public oppression. Again, as I said, Iranian clergy, we have the misfortune of having the dumbest clergy on the planet. It's not like Spain where the clergy is like a force of education, a force of administration, or was rather, not anymore. The clergy in Iran has always been about fraud. It has always been about personal gain, and yeah, like mandatory hijab is stupid. It's like it's as simple as that. Like when the majority, in fact, I would say, it's really funny. If you look in the early years of the Republic, Islamic Republic, more people had a proper hijab. They actually believed in it. They did it out of their own personal belief. Now, when you see people wearing hijab, all of them are half-assing it. None of them, in the capital, you don't see nearly don't see anyone wearing a proper hijab. They all wear it very loosely. Their clothes are very colorful. It's not black. Um, but people have become alienated towards the concept of hijab because it is enforced so badly. If people are going to naturally wear the hijab, then good. If they're not, then okay. But I agree that you should ban obscene like clothing, basically like children dressing as prostitutes or stuff like that. I would say even like some other forms of restriction should be made like very, very how do you say um, extremely how do you say it high miniskirts stuff like that. I think those are like problematic at some level, but I think the mandatory hijab as it is now and the cruelty that they impose because of it is stupid. And this
Can I ask you something about this, Pasha?
God,
Uh, how much of this is an element of class warfare? Like, for example, is there a peasant rural versus city urbanite
yes,
kind of
yes,
cultural war
yes,
going on? Because what you're
yes,
telling me reminds me a lot of Turkey. In
yeah, it
Turkey,
is.
for example, Erdogan's base is these peasants that are like backward and they are the way they are, right? Because Islamic fundamentalists, if you're a Westerner on Twitter, Billy, you think they're base, but if you actually met one, you would be highly unimpressed. This is what they always say to like Americans that think like I don't know, like the Arab peasant is based or something.
Iran and Turkey are very, very similar countries. Um, like the path that they took in the 20th century is identical. They had the Ataturk, we had Reza Shah. The only difference is that because we we were a bigger ally for the US, we fell victim to the whole narrative of the revolution and the subsequent regime. But if you would have let Iran to naturally progress under Shah, I would have said Iran and Turkey would be almost identical in the way they operate. Even now, they're like really similar. Like this whole urban
I mean,
versus
it's
rural.
extremely Turkic, right? Like the supreme leader is a Turk, correct?
Yeah, the supreme leader is a Turk.
Yeah.
So I just wanted you to elaborate while we're on that topic. I mean, I believe the Ayatollah is either fully or partly Azerbaijani, and I believe you are as well,
Yes.
Tarsus. Can you explain to the audience who might not know, why Iran is generally seems to be siding with, Orthodox Christian Armenia over Azerbaijan? Why? How would you explain this to the people listening here?
Okay. So the province. Okay. The country of Azerbaijan, or Republic of Azerbaijan as it is known now, is the former province of Iran, which belongs to Iran, even by the Treaty of Turkmenchai, signed between Iran and Russia. This territory was ceded to Russia for a period of 80 years, and this treaty expired 3 decades ago. And since then, this territory should be legally part of the Islamic Republic of Iran or any other sovereign power that has control over the nation of Iran. But for obvious reasons, this is not observed. Now, the two main reasons that Iran supports Armenia against Azerbaijan is that, first of all, that territory should be Iranian to begin with. And majority of Iranians agree that the concept of Azerbaijan as an independent country is absurd. This country is newer than Coca-Cola is. And this country has a very, very Persian Zoroastrian name. It means land of the fire. And it has always historically been Iranian. And in fact, at the period in time when Turkic dynasties left and right dominated Iran, and we had to spend so many centuries civilizing these people, it was these same Azeris who reasserted Iranian identity. The Safavid dynasty comes from the city that my mother comes from Ardabil. And these Azeri people, for the most part, have been some of the most fierce Iranians in the last centuries. They were the leaders of the constitutionalist movement against the Deccan and Qajar dynasty. These are the people who reestablished sovereign Iran, even though they were Turkic speaking. And yeah, the notion of independent Azerbaijan is absurd. This is Iranian territory. The second problem is that Azerbaijan has very, very, very close ties with it's the state of Israel. And why? I'll tell you why. Because Iranian Azerbaijan, these people are ethnically, genetically Iranian people who speak a Turkic language, right? Azerbaijan and Turkey actively make propaganda campaigns on this demographic to tell them you're not Iranians, you're Turks. And they advocate for the greater Turkish empire. And one of their slogans is that from Tabriz to Istanbul, and Tabriz is the most important city in Iran and Azerbaijan. Basically, they want this territory to be greater Turkish empire. So yeah, the state of Azerbaijan is a fake state, a breakaway Iranian province who actively tries to entice more separatist sentiments in Iranian Azeris, and to great success, I would say. More and more Azeris are being alienated to siding with the Republic of Azerbaijan than with their own country, Iran. So these are the reasons.
And there's a lot of them, correct?
Yeah,
Like,
there's
what
a
are
lot of them.
the
Yeah.
numbers here?
There are, I think, more than 18 million Azeris in Iran, but not all of them. I would say actually a minority are anti-Iranian, pro-Turk, but it's still a sizable minority. This wasn't the case. Another reason goes back to the incompetence and corruption of the Islamic Republic. So the narrative that these people follow in Azerbaijan is that the Islamic Republic is a Persian corrupt regime. So as Azeris, we have always been against this, right? So we're going to have our own Turkic alternative instead. And that solution is to break away entirely and join either Turkey or the Republic of Azerbaijan. This is the reason that we support Armenia.
I am certain that the Western powers must be really looking forward to doing like a Catalonia treatment to like half your country, right?
Yeah, Israel has direct links with separatist movements in the Khuzestan province, which has the Arab minority. They have direct links in Pakistan and the Baluchi minority that lives in Iran. They have direct links with Kurds. You can see in Iraqi Kurdistan, they always fly Israeli flags high and proud. And
Jesus, okay.
yeah, but Iran, as I said, it has such an authentic and historical heritage and identity. Even when the corruption is so high, even with everything that's going on, even with all the resentment towards the Islamic Republic, people have a very clear image that Iran would not be torn into several fake nation states. Iran is Iran. Like the mindset of the general population is always that Iran and its national sovereignty and its lands are uncompromisable. But yes,
yeah,
you have sizable.
This has to do, Billy. Do you remember this imbecile we were arguing that said Iran was a monoethnic country? Do you remember this guy?
I mean, there's a lot of really dumb white nationalists that get into that territory, but I think I know what you're talking about. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So my point is what people don't understand, and this is Westerners don't understand this, is ethno-nationalism, separatism, ethnic self-determination. These are very liberal, very Western ideas. People are generally okay with multi-ethnic imperialist society in Asia, for example. And part of all these things is, is the corrupting influence of the West. It comes into your country and it comes up to you and it says, no, you are not Iranian, you're Azeri, you're not Spaniard, you're a Catalan. Speaking of something I have witnessed firsthand, growing up in Spain, for example. Ethno-nationalism is really a tool of Western liberalism to divide and destroy countries. That's why I hate ethno-nationalists so much personally. I have a very deep disdain for the concept.
No, and that
Yeah.
sounds about right from people that tend to be more Duginist oriented in their thinking. Because, yeah, there is definitely some truth to the fact that a lot of times, especially in European history, ethno-nationalism has cynically been used by elites to start catastrophic wars, to, create these really dumb alliances, and to really just benefit the bourgeoisie in the end. So I totally get where you're coming from there, Lucian.
The end point of the end point of ethno-nationalism is independent Slovenia, right? So there is only one type of country that is sovereign, and that is the multi-ethnic, integralist, relatively culturally homogeneous empire.
Like Iran,
That's what
basically.
America is. That's what Iran is. That's what Russia is. That was China is. And that's why I really hate the ethno-nationalist discourse that comes out of, let's say, a lot of European far right, and why I think ultimately it's doomed to fail in that sense. But yeah, I'm going out of topic. I'm going to stop. Continue.
So do you kind of like agree with the European Union and sort of like, the idea that Europe needs to be sort of like an
No,
imperium?
no, fuck the French. No Germans. No. Italy, Spain, Spanish America, Portugal, Greece. That's what we need, sir.
I
We need
see.
civilizational continuity. We don't need to jam things together that don't belong together.
That makes sense. I can totally get where you're going from there. And then Parsis, I was just wondering, because I've noticed a lot of people complain about this a lot, and I think your insight would be good here. So, America for the past several months now, with the death of George Floyd, a cultural revolution sort of started in America at that time.
Yes.
And this has been, it's undeniable. This has been funded by, corporations like Amazon, Goldman Sachs, people, the very top corporations are leading these movements like Black Lives Matter, funding and deciding who's going to be at the top of these things. And I'm just curious, like, what do you think about that specifically? Like how, first off, how is it portrayed in Iran? And like, do you think that generally speaking, that the Iranian government is being smart about how they're treating Black Lives Matter and commenting on it?
So the sentiment of Iranian government is that they support these movements in the USA. They say that USA is inherently a racist country. What you have to understand is that Iranians are probably the least racist people on the planet. Like they don't really care what color you are. They care if you're an Arab, but that's a cultural, historical issue. A majority of them, even then, they don't really care about Arabs. They mostly are reactionaries against Islam. So, yes, the way the propaganda works here is that they say America is a nation built on slavery, built on guns, built on war, that continues to export war all over the planet. It has oppressed the black minority for like several decades, and now it's coming back to bite them. And the death of George Floyd was such a brutal act, and this never happens in Iran, and stuff like that, which is smart, which is really smart.
Now, do you think that's
But
done mainly to just sow more division into the U.S., generally speaking?
well, I mean, Iran doesn't have much propaganda power in the U.S. itself. It's more so to show Iranians that the USA is a fucked up country.
I
But
see.
the problem is that this is hypocritical because just 3 days ago we had a similar case, but it was much more brutal than George Floyd. An Iranian citizen was killed. This is a public issue even now, like on Twitter and on public platforms where people have civil discourses. The death of this young gentleman is a very hot topic. He was killed in a manner that he was innocent. He was just arrested. There was no charges. They handcuffed him to a pole and then electrocuted him repeatedly until he fucking died. And as I said, these cases of cruelty, like for no fucking reason. Like in America and with like black minority, we all know the percentage of guns and weaponry that Americans are susceptible to be carrying. Like there's so many guns. In Iran, we don't have many guns. We don't have many knives. We have very, very little guns and knives among the common population, and police brutality is still a common theme for no reason. Like there's no reason to have this level of overreaction. This guy was arrested for charges that we don't know, and then he was tied to a pole and electrocuted until he died in the city of Mashhad, I think this was. And because of that, now the backlash is that okay, so the Islamic Republic went on and on about George Floyd and racist American police brutality in the USA, but here they are killing their own citizens in a much worse manner. So as I said again, this propaganda could have worked if the mullahs weren't so fucking incompetent.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I could definitely see that. My only question is, like, how are there Iranian liberals who will both believe that America is this country that's extremely brutal towards black Americans and that is a de facto apartheid state that murders blacks all the time, and then they end up supporting Israel as well? Like, how does that end up happening?
Thing is that the majority of these people are not mutually exclusive. They're like from different branches, but the underlying okay, you see, you and I and people in our circles and your audience, they understand that these two things uh, do not add up. They are against one another. They're contradictory, right? But the problem is that, again, the average Iranian is kind of dumb. So they say, oh, America is a transition phase. So yes, there is police brutality, but they're trying to work it out. Joe Biden's good, right? This is the narrative that they go with because they're fed this in Iranian propaganda from abroad. And then Israel, they say, oh, yes, it might have been the land of the Palestinians all those years back, but now that they're there, what do we do? Do we just kill them all and give it back to Palestinians? We can't do that. There are people, there are women and children living there. We can't do that. So they say, oh yes, there is evil in this world. It's basically the basic NPC narrative. There is evil in the world. There's evil in Israel. There's evil in the USA. But humanity is trying to work it out. This is the narrative that they go with, essentially. Yes.
So basically, will these people tend to side more with like I guess the mainstream Israeli leftist parties like Benny Gantz and people like that?
They're not really, they don't really have insight on like Israeli politics, like what's the difference between Benny Gantz and like Netanyahu, right? But they say Israel, they see Israel and they don't know the shit that Israel does. Um, okay, I'm gonna simplify the matter for you, right? My father says that if somebody doesn't want to understand something, they're not gonna understand it, no matter how good you show it. And Yuri Bezmenov, I don't know if you have seen his video, the former USSR KGB agent. He says that when
Yeah, I'm
you
not a fan of
demoralize,
him, but I know what you mean. I know who he
yeah,
is.
but I know, but the part that he talks about demoralization is completely true. Doesn't matter if you take an Iranian to the West Bank and show the oppression, show the and show all the empirical evidence in the world on how Israel is the filth that it is. if this person is so demoralized that they're not going to accept, they don't want to accept, they're not going to accept what you're going to tell them. So again, yes, Israel has done bad in the past. Yes, that land is stolen. Some of them is straight up refuse to accept that that land is stolen. Like I know people who say, "Oh, the Israel has always been the Jewish land." I mean, look at history. This king, that king. Look at the Torah. This
Okay.
narrative actually exists. Yeah. So again, today, especially, this is also a byproduct of the modern world. I think we all agree, regardless of the nation and culture that we live in, people are becoming increasingly hostile towards
Hostile towards
one
what? You cut
another,
out. Sorry.
consumerism, towards one another, right?
Oh,
Like we're
okay.
becoming more civil. Like this is increased consumerism, lack of public discourse. Like in USA, for example, the manner in which the bipartisanism works in America, the way a conservative and a liberal hate each other essentially just because of the political beliefs, right? This is extreme in the USA, but it's also present in all other cultures. This is universal because of the modern world and the way it works, right? So at the end, they are so hell bent on the things that they believe, even if you show them that no, Israel has not been a land for the Jews for the past God knows how many thousands of years, and show them all the empirical evidence, because they're hell bent on hating you, they have already made up their mind. They're not going to accept what you're saying, no matter the evidence, no matter what you're going to propose to them. This exists in Iran to a lesser extent than it does in the USA, but I think this universally exists everywhere right now.
Okay, yeah, that's very good at contextualizing it, Yeah, I definitely agree. There's a lot of, I'd say the majority of people, they create an opinion and they try to rationalize it afterwards, and instead of trying to seek what is the actual ultimate truth.
Yeah. And especially when you go to history, right? Which is something that is dependent on the source, on the narrative, and then you can twist it and manipulate the lesser informed audiences. It becomes really vague history, right? There's so many different narratives. And when you go after history and say, "Oh, this has always been the land of the Jews," uh, that is such on such a deep level of conversation and logic and rhetoric. It's extremely difficult to change someone's opinion on historical matters, because, as I said, it's vague, different sources, different narratives, different sentiments, different corruptions. It all comes together to make, like, if somebody agrees with you that the state of Israel and, sorry, if somebody agrees with you that Israel has not been the land of the Jews for the past 15 centuries, and then you're going to have a conversation with them about all the illegitimate and corrupt actions that the state of Israel carries out now, you have a much, much simpler task at convincing this person, rather than when you compare it to someone who believes that this land has always been the land of the Jews, because, again, history is so vague, so um, narrative based. It's extremely difficult to change somebody's perspective on that. So if somebody's brainwashed on that level, I say you do yourself a favor and don't argue at all. This person is already probably lost.
Yeah, and I would ask you this, because I've seen this a lot, and I've had some people ask me this, to ask you. I've noticed a lot that in the white nationalist world, um, that a lot of people who are in it, they kind of they have like this dislike for Iran, because they're like, well, Iran, if they were smart, would be supporting white nationalists, because they have a moral case as to why white nationalism is legitimate, and it would benefit Iran to help destabilize America by supporting white nationalism. Yet Iran doesn't do that. Now, I actually don't blame Iran for not for like not supporting white nationalism. But my question is, like, what is the general view of American white nationalism in Iran that's fed by the government, if they even talk about it at all? And why do you think that's the case?
I think I am the only person who has even the slightest bit of sympathy for white nationalism in Iran, and I'm like an extremely rare exception. So, as I said, Iranians are really, really the least racist people on the planet. Like, I would say Indians and Iranians are probably the least racist because of their historical background and the idea of a race being, dominant or even hints of that, especially now that the Western media and Western values have infiltrated our discourse in Iran. I would say support for any ethnic nationalist movement is extremely, extremely low. With that said, Iranian the government has ties with like the likes of Richard Spencer and Dugin and like people like that. At the end, we are going to do whatever it is that is beneficiary for us at the moment. That um, is like Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro had to become a communist in order to withstand the American aggression, to have support from the USSR. And while in our Iranian culture and tradition, we don't support any racist or any racially supremacist or even racial nationalist ideas. If that is what it takes, if having Richard Spencer on national TV or having Stryker or David Duke coming to Iran in conferences, having their opinion, establishing some ties for potential cooperation in the future. If that is what it takes, sure, we're going to do that. We're in a state of survival right now, so anything that helps, it helps. But as I said, culturally and part of our heritage, the way it works is that we really never support racial nationalism or uh, racial supremacy. I personally don't.
Narcissus,
Um,
I have a
yes,
question about this. So
go
this
ahead.
is very important. Okay? I want you to take this question very seriously.
Right.
Does the Ayatollah support the worship of the god Apollo? This is very, very important to me.
I mean, I mean, I don't know.
So you don't.
Probably.
So what you're telling me is that you are not an Apollonian. Is this what you're telling
No.
me? Do you have any wooden spoons in your house, Parsis?
Yes.
Are they big?
Um, yes.
You use them to violently abuse Apollonians.
Uh, no.
You this joke because you're not. You traffic in
Yeah.
like higher circles.
Yeah.
So
Oh
a
my
lot of
God.
people are going to find this very funny. Trust me.
The
Yeah,
thing
they
is that
definitely will.
the thing is that Iranians are sarcastic, but their sarcasm is like from a different nature than the Europeans and European-oriented cultures. So a lot of time when I'm talking with Lucian or our other friends, they say stuff and I just flat out don't understand it. Much like now. Yes.
Well, I've never seen any evidence of Iran supporting Richard Spencer. What do you mean by that? Could you elaborate a little bit more? Because I would just be shocked that Iran would support someone like Spencer who openly supports I guess a white empire that would rule specifically over non-whites, including Iran.
Well, if we take into account that, first of all, um, Richard Spencer, if you say he's a neo-Nazi or Natsak or whatever, then the Iranians are all the Aryans. If he's not part of that, as I said, if you're not really at this point in our country's history, we're not looking for mutual ideological points that, oh my God, we agree so much, let's work together. It's more like a state of survival. Let's say Richard Spencer has some gains of working with Iran, and Iran might have some gains from working with Richard Spencer. So they both go, yeah, okay. More so Iran than Richard Spencer, because as I understand, Richard Spencer is a rich man, doesn't have any need for Islamic Republic. It's just another, oh, cool, we have a collaboration, it's a prestige thing. Whereas Iran needs allies in every ideological department that might prove useful for it in the future. So it's not about ideological agreements, it's about what's going to help me now. As I said, Fidel
Exactly. Yeah.
Castro.
Like I
Okay.
agree with you. I'm just my whole point has been and a big reason why I like want nothing to do with the white nationalist scene anymore is because again, I believe it's filled with a lot of really just kind of just weird people, supremacist people that aren't genuine when they say that they represent like the white working class. And I think that a lot of these people are just hobbyists or people that want to find like a social
Wait,
club where
wait,
they can
wait, wait.
what
Are you telling me that the white working class doesn't need to hear how they are Apollonian snowmen from the highlands of Scandinavia and how they was kings in ancient China. Are you telling me this is not what the working class needs? Like when I see a white guy ODing on heroin, I go up to him and I tell him, "You're dishonoring yourself. You're the descendant of Turkic tribes from Central Asia that conquered Iran and the Inca Empire." Like, come on.
No, exactly, and that's what a lot of this stuff has really turned into. And again, I believe that white nationalism just kind of become like a group therapy session for miscontent white people.
Therapy like liberals. It's like,
Well, yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of like actual racist feminists now and racist liberals. Like they don't even hide it anymore.
It reminds me of this. I'm sorry, I'm taking the conversation away from Iran, the white supremacist I am. So it reminds me of when you meet like brown women that are in university in the US and like this critical race theory thing. All of this is like therapy, right? It sounds like they're talking to psychologists. It's like, oh, I feel alienated by like the system. Like, this thing going over and over. It's pathetic. Go on.
Was it just me or was he cutting out?
I'm literally naked, by the way, because I just got out of the bathroom. So I'm walking around my house naked, ranting about Apollonians, which is very Apollonian, in all honesty.
Oh yeah, it's very, very much so. But that's sort of the thing is like, and this is a big thing that actually has upset a lot of Muslims that I'm friends with on Twitter who have been feuding with a lot of these white nationalists, is that these Apollonians, who are for the most part, I guess, usually the Germanic descendant of Germanic immigrants into the United States, are making this argument that they have more of a claim to Iran and Persia than the actual Iranians that are living there, and they label people like you, Persis, as just Arabs that have diluted Persia and Iran. And I think it's just like, if this is your ideology, it's like, I don't want anything to do with this. Like, this is just garbage. This isn't what serious people are into. And I just, it's just, I wouldn't feel good with my conscience contributing to such a scene anymore. So I just don't.
These people usually role play on Skyrim, so I think they're not the threat. We just have to leave them to their own devices, but they're not a threat. They're just a bunch of retards. There's no... Even mentioning them, I think, is like a waste of breath, so, yeah.
I mean, Persis, I am more Persian than you are because I look like Cyrus, and you don't, so...
I mean, you don't have the nose.
So I have the nose.
Cyrus had the Shlomo nose. You don't have the Shlomo nose.
Oy vey, Goyim, you're gonna come into my empire, Goyim.
So I want to ask you this too. So yeah, it seems like you don't take these people seriously. Nobody does, but unfortunately, this is considered to be serious in the white nationalist sphere, which is why, again, I don't like it. I would ask you this. These are going to be some hot button topics. Probably we could wrap up the show with unless more things pop up. But right. How would you say the government of Iran deals with, I guess, both Jews and homosexuals? And we can start with Jews. Like how are, because I've done some reading, and from what I've read from like more mainstream sources, I've read that Jews generally tend to, I mean, there's a large Jewish community in Iran, one of the largest in the Middle East, actually, but I believe they are kept out of important sectors of the economy, like media, like finance, like banking, things like that, but they're allowed to go, and they're very overrepresented in things like the medical field. Is this true in your opinion, or do you think there is a lot of untruth to what I've picked up on reading on this topic?
Before the revolution, the Jews in Iran were going the same path that the Jews in Europe went. That is to say, they were slowly starting to dominate politics and science and medical fields, as you said. But after the revolutions, when they saw there's no hope for them to continue doing this, the majority of them left for Israel. Those that have remained in Iran are not much different than other Iranians. In fact, I'd say I have met a Jewish person in Iran, and this person, at first glance, I didn't even know this guy was Jewish, but like like until 6 months after I met him and we had discourse. To me, the Jews that have remained in Iran are much like any other Iranian. It's so undistinguishable that I didn't notice that this guy was Jewish for 6 months, and even then I heard from his friend that he's Jewish. So the way that we treat it, we don't have a thing against Jews as a whole. Even at the doctrine and at the books that the Supreme Leader has published, it says that the question is about Jews, that we have nothing against Jews, we have things against Zionism. And when I say we, I mean the Islamic Republic and the government of Iran. And all religious minorities of Iran, Zoroastrians, Christians, and Jews, are represented in parliament proportionally based on the population and the districts in which their populations are present. And in many cases, Christian, Zoroastrian, and Jewish minorities have extra privileges when compared to the majority Shia. For example, Shia are forbidden by law to consume alcohol, whereas Zoroastrians, Jews, and Christians have the right to consume alcohol, and yeah, stuff like that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this. Do you think, because, based on my limited studies of things like Jews in places like Islamic Spain and other spots like the Ottoman Empire, do you think there is any possibility, a strong one at least, that there is a large contingent of, I guess, like Don May or crypto Jews that exist in Iran that, do this, they practice Judaism and try to organize Jewish power and gain more power secretly, but outwardly they pretend to be Muslim. Do you think this is something that Iran needs to be concerned about, or this is a legitimate threat that it's facing?
We had this phenomena early in the revolution. In fact, early in the constitutionalist movement, early in the 20th century, we had this phenomena where many Jews actually infiltrated the clergy. They became Muslim clerics as crypto Jews. And later on in the Shah's regime, many of the ministers of the cabinet, in fact, sometimes a majority of them were such crypto Jews, and some of these clerics, even to this day, I suspect, continue to exist as crypto Jews within the Iranian government at like lower levels, not to a significant um, level, but as a public thing, to say that the Jews of Iran are a threat to Iran in a sense that they would infiltrate or maintain crypto Jewish status in order to one day come out and take control and facilitate Israeli invasion or Israeli infiltration. I don't think that's a threat. I don't think the Jewish population in Iran are a threat, and I don't think the crypto Jews in the Iranian government are a major threat. Maybe a very minor threat, but not a major threat.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then on the topic of, this is like a big thing that a lot of people, I feel like, don't have a proper perception of, things like homosexuality and transsexuals in Iran. Like, for example, a lot of people who are both like self-identify as communists and as fascists have this idea in Iran that, for example, getting a gender reassignment surgery is something that just happens all the time and is something that is like sometimes as a way to punish homosexual people, or if not to punish them, to, like, I guess, correct the problem. Based on my understanding and what I've taught, what I've kind of looked up, to me it seems like gender dysmorphia in Iran is something that is extremely rare, and they're accommodating for people that, I guess, tend to organically have this problem. But I think generally speaking, this isn't this idea of transgenderism, the way it's known in the West, is not pushed on the population in the
No,
West,
no,
in the same way it is in the West.
no. The doctrine of Iran is that homosexuality is forbidden, punishable by death, and they say that if a homosexual act is taking place, they don't use the word homosexual. They say that if this person is afflicted with gender dysphoria, then the treatment, as it is sponsored by the state, is a gender reassignment. But this is a meme on the internet that Iran has a disproportionately high amount of transgender people, and I can say that the amount of transgenders that I've seen in my life are less than the number of my fingers on my hands. And the thing that it works is that the way it works is that you have to go to a therapist, and this therapist will examine you for an extensive amount of time. And if he or she recognizes that you have this dysphoria dysfunction, then you will have a permit to conduct such surgery. Now, another common question is that why are all LGBT rights restricted in Iran, but gender reassignment surgeries are allowed? Now, I am opposed to these surgeries being allowed. I consider them mutilation. Um, as I said, the clergy are the dumbest faction in Iranian history, the Shia clergy, that is to say. And this was actually banned early in the revolution until a transgender activist was transgender themselves. I don't know. I don't remember the name, but if you want, I can look it up or ask my mother. I think she's informed on this. She or he or whatever you want to call it. This person went to Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic, and explained to him their situation about what's going on. And Khomeini, being the dumb rock that he is on these matters, gave a fatwa and legalized this. And since then, this has been legalized. Like, this is a very bizarre thing. Why should every LGBT right be outlawed? And I support them being outlawed. These rights are not rights; these are preventions. But such a if by their own Islamic doctrine we're going to say that the creation is created the way it is, that the God's creation is perfect, then why would someone, their gender of their soul be trapped in the wrong body? Like, this doesn't make any sense. This is just the case of Khomeini. Probably felt bad for this person, thought that this is somebody inhuman. He's dumb. He's not exactly the brightest person. So he gave a fatwa legalizing it, and as I said, it's really, really bizarre, and it has come to evolve to a point where it is associated with being a treatment for homosexuality. As I say, I'm not much informed on the process of how this works, about the therapy sessions, about the laws, but the limited info that I have are the things that I said. Yes.
Okay, yeah, that's more or less kind of how I anticipated your answer was going to be.
Yeah.
Let's see here. Oh, I would ask you this as well. So if someone who's listening to this show wants to like read literature from Iran that is, available in English to help gain an actual more realistic understanding of like, how politics works, how sociology works, how all of these sorts of internal things work, from actual Iranian sources who know what they're talking about and not from just Western propaganda outlets. What sort of like books would you recommend that these people seek out?
I would say on the nature of, I'm not greatly informed on this, but the sources that I can recite is that Ahmad Kasravi, he was a constitutionalist early in the 20th century, and he explains everything about the falls, for example, how Shia Islam came to be, how the Iranian society is kind of ignorant towards their own identity at that point. So I would say Ahmad Kasravi, his history of constitutionalist movement, his history of Azerbaijan, and his analysis of the Shia faith. Yes, Ahmad Kasravi is definitely somebody who you should read. Other than that, if you want to understand exactly how the theocratic and governmental laws blend in with each other in the Islamic Republic, I suggest that you read the book of fatwas and Q's and A's that the Supreme Leader has done. Um, Other sources of literature, I'm not really familiar with it, but I can give you a list, I think, very soon if you want, before you edit this and publish it, that you can use to as a the text list to attach. But yes, I would say definitely Ahmad Kasravi has the best analysis of Iranian society and the way it will evolve to be in the next 100 years. And this is from the early constitutionalist movement, early 20th century. And the author actually was stabbed to death by Islamic fundamentalists because he had triggered them so much. Yeah.
Okay, I see. And then
Yeah.
I actually have one more question from a guy I really like, Zero Schizo. You may have heard of him. But he asked me to ask you about what your opinion is on the Iranian revolutionary and sociologist named Ali Shariati, I think is his name.
Yes, Dr. Shariati, as we call him, Dr. Shariati. Shariati is really influential in intellectual circles of Iran, but the problem is that intellectual those intellectual circles that tend to agree with Shariati are more or less not as intellectual as they seem. But Shariati has some valid cases about, I think, the nature of Iranian society, the nature of religion. What you have to understand is that we have a lot of the Sufi. I'm not sure if your audience or yourself is familiar with Sufism. Sufism is basically a spiritual Islam. I like to call it hippie Islam. And in intellectual circles of Iran, we have a lot of Sufi influences. So Shariati also had a lot of Sufi influences on those circles. His takes on religion connected with the people of the time and those circles. Um, but as time has went on, he has kind of lost his track. I mean, he's dead nowadays, obviously, but his ideas have become more obsolete. But I think for his own time, al-Shariati had a good understanding of Iranian society, of the role of the religion and stuff like that. But as I said, those intellectual circles are considered to be outdated nowadays. But still, he has a very large minority support in intellectual circles. Yes. But
Okay,
Shariati is
awesome. Yeah.
famous. Shariati is the type of guy that you would go on Facebook and Instagram and see quotes by him everywhere amongst those circles. Yeah,
Hmm.
he's like a pseudo intellectual, but nowadays I think he's obsolete. But still, he has, as I said, a large fan base.
Okay, and then I'm going to ask you this. Um, well, I already kind of feel like I know where you're going to go with this, but it seems like you're generally not very optimistic of Iran's future. What do you think is in store for Iran, if you had to guess, for like the next 20 to 30 years? Like what people are going to see in terms of like how its foreign policy is going to operate and how domestically it's going to change.
I think that Iran, if it maintains the current form of governance and the current economic situation and the current levels of corruption, it's not going to see the next 10 years, the Islamic Republic. I don't think that's plausible. Even the next 5 years are like kind of dubious. But for the next 20 years, like Iran is such a wide variety of beliefs on a spectrum that ranges from everything to like ultra Iranian imperialism and nationalism to like extremely far left libertarian, like Joe Biden, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez-esque ideas on the left that you really cannot predict that if the Islamic Republic fails to reform, if it fails to reduce corruption, if it fails to improve economy, it it dissolves. What will prevail? Would a more rural, more conservative, more militant part of the population be successful of forming a new uncorrupt government that is also conscious on the fact that cooperation with Americans and Israel is never viable? That take place, or will America use its influence to um, bring about a new quote unquote democratic leftist dominated again quote unquote democracy that would have open market for their exploitation? Like it's really hard to say, but one thing I can say with absolute certainty, if the current economic, social, and corruption continues, the Islamic Republic will not see the next 10 years, definitely.
Okay, and then I want to ask you this too,
Yeah.
because I think this is interesting. So Trump is according to Israeli polls, really favored by Israel in this presidential election. And then, in contrary, American Jews tend to really favor Biden by a huge margin. My question is, why do you think this is the case? And what do you think of the Iran deal and the fact that Trump came in and got rid of it?
I think that the results of this election and the results of any US election for the past 100 years is completely irrelevant to US foreign policy. I think if Joe Biden is going to restore the Iran deal, that's a slow way of entering Iran, getting concessions, getting to bring investors in to basically consolidate their hold and expand on Iranian market and industry. That is the Biden-Obama Democratic approach to basically colonizing Iran, while I think Trump's approach is a much more severe. We're going to end this in like next 5 years approach, uh, extreme sanctions and economic pressure, which I like to add like the sanctions on medicine, especially with the coronavirus outbreak, and the sanctions on Iran cannot buy anything from the international market. Everything that it buys, all the medicine, all the food that it imports is from the black market. We essentially are cut off from the rest of the world. Only a select few countries trade with us, and especially the medical sanctions are in place, especially in the pandemic. I think is nothing short of a genocide that Trump is imposing on Iran. But what is happening is that yes, I don't think the results of the election matter in the slightest bit. Maybe if Biden is elected, we have maybe a bit more prolonged mediocrity period, like economy will maybe very uh, pessimistically improve just a bit, and we will
But it's
make
going
a
to come
new
with a
deal.
cost. Like they're going to put
Yes,
in
of
so much more
course,
liberalism.
of course, yes, of course. And if Trump is elected, I think it's more violence and chaos bound because Iran will only get worse economically if Trump is elected, whereas Biden has some hopes of maybe easing a bit on the economy, but we have to give concessions, of course. So many concessions to be given to Biden. As your question is why the Jews and in Israel and the Jews in America are much more differently aligned. Um, as I said, I don't think it really matters. I don't know why it happens. I'm not gonna pretend I know or analyze it in the moment and give an answer. But my ultimate answer is that it doesn't really matter because U.S. foreign
So,
policy,
sorry,
the end
you
goal is
just cut
always the same. Now,
off.
Biden
You just cut off. You said right at the
is
point
gonna
where you're like,
um,
you're talking about how it doesn't matter. Sorry.
results really don't matter. Biden is gonna slowly reach the American foreign policy goals, and Trump's gonna do it much more harshly. I don't think really.
This is
But
real third world hours versus with your internet.
yes. I would say I would like for Biden to win.
You'd
Although it
prefer
doesn't make any
Biden.
difference. Yes, I think Biden is a much weaker choice. It will increase social um, discontent and social polarization in America. It will lead to more chaos in America, I believe. But that is something that's going to happen either way. Both the domestic politics of, like, let me say it this way: between Biden and Trump, I don't really see a distinction, but if it was my personal choice, I would go for Biden just because it's a bit more, you know, just a bit more optimized for my own personal life goals as the moment is. But
All
it's
right.
not a
Yeah.
choice that let's say if Trump wins and Biden loses, I'm not gonna lose my mind. Like of
Yeah.
course, it's all the same. It doesn't matter.
It really is. Biden and Trump are both heavy supporters of the Zionist state, heavy supporters of Judaism. They're not gonna, I don't think, be super radically different in their goals. The strategies, I think, are going to be primarily what's going to differ in how both Biden and Trump think they're going to benefit Israel. But at the end of the day, it's just a disagreement of tactics, not the overall goal of, Jewish supremacy over the Middle East and the rest of the world, which is what Israel's really about, in my opinion.